Stanford University.
Today's class session is on resource technology innovations addressing climate change and resource scarcity. I'm excited that we have Tom and John here today, since they both know that they're my two favorite people when it comes to leaders who are addressing our society's big challenge of climate change. John Weyant's a professor at Stanford. He's also director of the Energy Modeling Forum, as well as deputy director of the Precor Institute at Stanford. He was also a lead author of the IPCC report that led him to be recognized for the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. And he's also been honored for his contributions to the California Air Resources Board for his work on AB 32. Tom is an absolute icon in Silicon Valley. He's started various venture funds and has invested in many significant companies since the 1980s. He's currently the managing director of Baruch Future Ventures. He previously founded the venture funds Formation 8, as well as CMEA Capital. He was a founding member of Obama's National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And he's also an advisor to just a number of initiatives, including Breakthrough Energy Ventures. A few years ago, John and I authored a book titled Renewed Energy, of which Tom was featured in a chapter of it. Excited to have both of you here today. We'll go ahead and get started with a few questions. I thought it would be useful to frame the conversation of climate change around a few key resources that are fundamental and essential for human survival and for preserving and expanding life. And these include food, water, air, and shelter. And just discussing those resources and innovations around them and issues we need to consider as well. First question I have is in terms of climate change and the connection between climate change and its impact on resource scarcity. John, could you help us clarify what is the connection between climate change and its impact on resource scarcity?
That's a really huge and complicated question, but I'll do my best to be brief. I guess I'll give a little bit in the order in which I learned it. So obviously, changes in climate affect outdoor activities of great importance like agriculture, forestry. They have an impact on what is typically termed unmanaged ecosystems, managed and unmanaged forests. So there are major connections there. They actually go a little bit in both directions, but mostly bad. Could lead to a tipping point. We now have a situation where of the greenhouse gases emitted, about half stay in the atmosphere, about a quarter. I'm not even up on the most recent debate about whether a quarter or more goes into the ocean and a quarter or more goes into growing things, because plants take in carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen, the opposite of living of humans and animals. So that was the first thing. And then I got into the climate game on the energy systems mitigation side. So that's taken me now 25, 30 years to look into that and work with various groups, including several IPCC rounds on what we might be able to do on that side. At the same time, I've been consistently drawn back into the impact side. So now we know it's not just about growing things, but these changes in climate can affect human health directly and indirectly. They can affect the way we use land, water, and energy. Through the Carnot cycle effect, they actually make the thermal power plants less efficient. Increases in temperature also cause problems with thermal pollution in waterways. So there are EPA restrictions on that, which could cause power plants to be shut down. And more recently, but perhaps importantly, a whole host of things that are more in the extreme event category, namely flooding, coastal zone damage, droughts, and more recently, wildfires here across the West Coast. So we're now actively trying to figure out what goes on, what causes it. I wouldn't say all the impacts are completely attributable to climate change, but the balance of evidence suggests a great share of what's gone on has been pretty easily attributable to climate change. Sorry to be so long-winded.
And Tom, I mentioned air, food, water, and shelter as 4 critical resources. How do you think about investing in those areas and driving innovation in those areas?
Yeah, I think you omitted one factor, and that's energy, of course, embedded in all the other 4 that you did mention, including shelter. But when you think about innovating in those areas, I generally think mostly in power law terms and how we can take advantage of two of the greatest inventions in the history of humankind. One, the semiconductor, and the other is the discovery of DNA. Remarkably, those two events occurred within a few years of each other in the period 1947 to 1955, after one of the worst centuries of humans' existence. And ever since that time, we've been able to adopt these exponential technologies, power law technologies, to creating technology-driven change. Where we find the most fruitful outcomes is in the intersection of multiple technologies. So we spend a lot of our time in biology, in information technology, and material science. Picture a Venn diagram of those disciplines and look for the sweet spot. And you will be able to identify an opportunity to change the way things are done and to change the way people think about things. And we have many examples that I could recite, but that would take the rest of this session. So let's leave it at that for now.
Sounds good. Excited to also dive into some of these examples later today. Tom, what motivated you to address the problem of climate change and resource scarcity in the first place?
I think it was just that. It was the power law aspects of climate change. Like the emoji slapped me in the head. It just becomes so obvious that one thing just always leads to another. And so there are the edge that we're living on right now is so sensitive. And as we continue to dump CO2 into the atmosphere and continue to practice other unacceptable and environmental practices, we're just pushing over the tipping point, and we're pushing it at a faster rate because obviously global warming is one consequence of all this, but there are many other consequences, as we've seen recently. For example, in the melting of the polar ice cap, suddenly now there's huge concern about methane in Bering Sea. All that methane has been encased in ice. Once that ice melts, methane is 84 times more powerful as greenhouse gas as CO2. So we have to deal not only with CO2, we have to deal with methane. We have to deal with the exponential consequences of the actions that we're taking as humans. And that's what's so scary. But at the same time, we've been blessed with the power law disciplines that I talked about earlier, and their intersections of those disciplines as a means of addressing it. And I don't want to say that technology is the only solution. It certainly is not. There are many others that are more behavioral in nature and regulatory and otherwise.
What about you, John? What motivated you to address the problem?
Interesting. I think this optimism about technology is something Tom and I definitely share. Even more interestingly, I actually grew up about 5 or 10 miles from Murrayham, New Jersey. So as a little kid, I heard all the legendary stories about the invention of the transistor at Bell Labs back at that point. I would say for me, I think Ernestine knows this backstory on me. I grew up in the age of Sputnik and wanted to do something with my somewhat limited analytic skills as a kid, which I didn't screw up and still have a little bit of today, to solve big societal problems. So that was always my motivation. So I started with aerospace. I was originally aero-astro guy trying to win the race to space, and ultimately the Cold War. Got involved early in my 20s at a well-known Pentagon think tank on national security, trying to think about nuclear arms control, race to space, even using R&D as a competitive thing against the other dominant superpower at that point. And then fortunately for me, in a way, my RAND group and I both thought of energy environment as being the next big, or among the next big set of societal challenges. We were and then morphed into oil security for a while, which did have a technological edge, but many other geopolitical edges and so on. And then by the early 90s, it looked like the big new challenge for the day, maybe a bigger one than all the other energy ones, at least, and resource ones, was climate change. And a friend of mine said you ought to switch completely into climate change and climate change analyses. And I thought he was crazy for about a year. And then as information emerged and I got more knowledgeable, I said, by golly, I think you're right. So that's really how I got into climate change. And once I got into it, it's been hard. I still do a few other things, but it's dominated my life for the last 25 years at least.
I want to dive into air specifically, one of the resources I mentioned. And John, could you clarify what is the cause of industrial air pollution? For instance, Tom briefly alluded to methane and CO2, but what has caused the massive air quality problem that we face today?
So most of it is combustion of fossil fuels, the commercial ones, oil, gas, and particularly coal. That produces not just carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, but a range of what EPA calls criteria pollutants. When I was a kid, we didn't have criteria pollutants and we didn't know it was there. I remember going to my summer internship even then in SoCal, and you could barely see anything, none of the buildings as I drove in the end of my cross-country journey. And by then, even then, this is in the late 1970s, early 1980s, they had gotten all of the oil refineries and power plants out of the LA basin. And a guy actually got very famous, a well-known atmospheric chemist, for saying, maybe it's the cars. So the cars actually produced a lot of pollutants, nitrous oxide, some particles and whatnot. And as we now know, those are among the most critically evaluated air pollutants. So just to give you an updated global perspective, the World Health Organization, through the Global Burden of Disease study, attributes around 7 million deaths a year to particle pollution, about half indoor and half outdoor. So the indoor type is largely in developing regions where they have cook stoves that work on twigs and cow dung, and they seal up their dwellings and get really bad. They get rid of all the insects and the food tastes good, but in fact, they also suffer dire health consequences. In our part of the world, it is mostly these coal and other emissions, say, in developed China and major cities in the US. For the last 30 or 40 years, we've gotten more and more of a handle on how many premature deaths and other health impacts have come from pollutants, largely associated with some of the same fossil fuels that cause climate change.
Tom, I know you're an investor in some companies that are tackling our air quality problems, such as Mosaic Materials and Wind. Could you share more about new processes that you've seen that can make an impact on global CO2 emissions and doing that while simultaneously lowering energy costs?
Yeah, I think in thinking about emissions, you have to think about those that are obvious and insidious, and those that are just insidious. The obvious and insidious are ones that John mentioned, CO2 and methane, but then that's only the beginning of the list. And not only do you have to be concerned about species, but you have to be concerned about particle size, because those kinds of emissions that are smaller than, say, 2.5 microns actually can be absorbed by our bodies through the lungs, can create huge kinds of healthcare problems, such as the ones that John was referring to. So this is a real multi-body problem, not easily solvable. We found that the most effective means we found so far are those separations technologies or sensor technologies that can eliminate the very fine particle size. That's probably a good place to start. But then when we move over, and then there's mercury, other emissions from coal-fired power plants, which are usually trace elements in coal, but there are also many trace elements in oil and gas as well. We have to be concerned about all that. There's been a lot of progress made in the US and various kinds of scrubbing techniques associated with industrial processes, but those kinds of regulations don't exist in much of the third world. So, and we all live on one planet, so we have to deal with that. But I think another very insidious aspect of all this is COVID-19 and other kinds of contaminants and viral particles that exist in the atmosphere. That's one of the aspects that are portfolio company, Wind, is addressing that you mentioned. But it's the other aspect is then the obvious and insidious. So that's the CO2 and methane primarily that contribute to global warming. And that's a whole separate subject.
Any other thoughts from either of you in terms of our air quality problem and what we need to do to address that before we move on to the next resource that I'd like to talk about?
I think there's been a lot of discussion about this whole subject of CO2 emissions and methane emissions, primarily CO2. Everybody by now, I think, knows the numbers: 417 parts per million, increasing at a rate of 1 to 2 parts per million between now and 2050. Goal of breakthrough energy is to identify enough new technologies to apply to reduce that to zero by 2050. Frankly, I don't think that's good enough, but at least it's a place to start. And I think that the solutions to the whole CO2 problem can be found not only in technologies, but also in innovative business models and financial fintech. I'd see innovative business models and fintech as an opportunity to change people's behavior, which everybody says you can't do. But then I see it happening all the time. So you can change people's behavior. You have to give them a little push. Sometimes that comes from an innovative business model or financial technology. We can do a lot, and we're not, the fact is we're not doing enough until we get to zero and then start restoring the atmosphere. We haven't done enough.
So talking about food security as a resource, John, question for you is, could you clarify the relationship between climate change and today's food security crisis? What are the factors contributing to our food security crisis today?
Again, quite a complex set of interrelationships. I already mentioned that climate change could increase productivity of agricultural crops for a while, but ultimately they're all going to go down. I have some econ colleagues who say all you have to do is switch to different crops, and I have a feeling they think it's reasonable to expect the whole world will be living off bananas or other crops like that. And then as temperatures get too warm for even them to grow any place, what are you going to do? So I think that's where we start in this. If you look at more detail in the how we use land and whatnot, a big surprise to me even the last 10 years has been the extent to which a lot of land is used for beef production, and very inefficiently. So in Brazil, we had a great burning down of rainforest to create pastures and also more recently grow fairly inefficient forms of biocrops. And in the need to go very low, people have now reanalyzed this and recognized that Brazil takes about twice as much land to grow a head of cattle than the developed world. And ecologists have now gone out and figured out that you probably could reclaim that land, which would be a great boon for climate, because you could either grow trees or advanced biofuels or more crops there. That's where the rubber meets the road. There are lots of emissions from the ag sector. There's, again, methane emissions from bovine cattle and goats. Those are remarkably large numbers that people don't fully realize. Now, the other thing there are two other things at the macro scale that are important, and that is agricultural productivity. We've lived on the earth trying to sustain a ever-growing population by higher productivity, more crops per unit area, sometimes doing that with nitrogen fertilizers, which may be bad for air and water pollution, but also for climate change. Some of the scarier scenarios I've seen as the rest of the world becomes like the meat eaters of the world, and that leads to a lot more emissions and a lot more land use, as well as being not so good for our health personally. So I think that's a new frontier. On the Tom Baruch side, some of the more interesting schemes I've seen for innovative crosscut technologies would provide both, say, microalgae for energy, and possibly, he can tell you more than I can, low-cost ways of protein that you could actually find the land to grow, because they might be on the coast or even in the ocean. So I think there's quite a strong set of interactions in both directions between the climate system and the agriculture activities and food supply.
Tom, John just alluded to some of the innovations that you're possibly investing in and looking at to address the problem of food security. Could you share more about that? I know you're an investor in companies that are looking at, for instance, beef production was mentioned. So Blue Nest Beef is one of your investments, Callista as another. And just in general, your thoughts on what we need to do to ensure food security and sustainable agriculture.
Do we have until midnight?
Or longer, maybe a few.
Yeah, it's a tough problem, but very simply, what I find amazing is John's talking about the destruction of the rainforests in Brazil. And a lot of that destruction is actually being done in order to use the land to grow soy, which then is being used to make Impossible burgers.
I feel like we're in a Shakespeare play now, Tom.
So I'm a great proponent of synthetic protein, and the doorway to synthetic protein is exactly in the intersection of technologies that I talked about earlier, and that's in the intersection of biology and information technology. There are a number of companies addressing the opportunity to essentially make protein from DNA, and it's not terribly far from reality. The company you mentioned, Callista, is a company that's making protein by using methane as a feedstock. So we combine methane and oxygen and a few other relatively available elements in a way and use a biological catalyst, we call the methanotrope, which can enable us to convert these elements into amino acids and proteins. What Callista has a multi-tiered market approach, beginning initially with using synthetic protein to feed fish that are raised on aqua farms. Today, about 50% of carnivorous fish like salmon are raised on aqua farms, mostly in and around the North Sea. And currently they're being fed anchovies that are harvested off the coast of Chile and shipped in freighters to the North Sea. And we can eliminate all of that. The fuel involved, we can eliminate some methane, not a lot, but some. But more importantly, if you look at the logistics aspects of all this is really important. Oil and gas companies have known that for hundreds of years, because oil and gas is often found in places where it can't be used. So the issue is how do you get downstream to customers? And what COVID-19 has done is exposed the fragility of our supply chains. And if you look at meat, for example, what happened during the worst parts of the pandemic, all the value-added meat functions were shut down. The world today depends on meat from primarily Argentina, Brazil, and the US. And that's it. And the supply chain is ugly. Anybody who's seen much of what goes on in the cattle yards in Chicago knows what that's all about. We can eliminate all of that with synthetic protein. We can make protein available any place where there's methane. And unfortunately, there's too much methane as it is. Price of methane now is almost free. And this is one of the primary business aspects that we look at is energy has become free. Relatively pure water can be now derived at very low cost. And we can make protein cheaply, and we can make it where we consume it. And so we totally take out our dependency supply chains and on certain big companies like Cargill, who we really don't need anymore. I don't think anybody would be bothered by seeing Cargill disappear. There's, again, examples of what we can do with synthetic biology and our ability to tip the scales in the other direction in terms of climate change.
I want to talk about water treatment and conservation next. Tom, I'm going to hand it back to you in terms of the idea that during water treatment, one of the ideal solutions is having zero liquid discharge. So that's where all water is recovered and contaminants are reduced to solid waste. When can we get to that point? Do you have any thoughts on that and in general, how we can provide access to clean water in the future?
Yeah, of course, in actually the new Bill Gates book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, he talks about water. There are 5 billion people, probably 60 to 75% of global population will be without adequate supplies of water due to climate change. That's a very direct impact of climate change. Then you can, as we turn more of North Africa and Europe into desert, then we're only accentuating the water problem. There's another aspect of water that I think is interesting, and that is, again, back to supply chain. Today, water is generally harvested several hundred miles from the destination where it's used. We use an enormous amount of energy to move water. I've seen estimates that in California, 20 to 30% of our energy consumption is simply to move water. So we're moving water from the Sierras to San Francisco, Palo Alto, etc., Southern California. And the opportunity here with technology is to be able to democratize those supply chains. So we talk about democratizing a food supply chain, protein. We can do the same thing with water. So Source Global is a company that we're involved with that's harvesting water from the atmosphere. We can work in environments where humidity ranges from 10 to 90%, and the water is derived on your rooftop because we use solar energy to purify the water. Pretty amazing. We can produce water for 1 to 2 cents a liter. And it's the same quality that you would pay $2 a liter for if you buy it at the nearest convenience store. So still more expensive than municipal water, but in certain regions of the world, people will pay more for clean water, especially very pure water, which is what Source Water is. We're working with another company that is come up with a wave energy approach. So the Source Water approach uses solar energy, which is a race to zero. In the case of the other startup that we recently invested in, we use wave energy as a means of desalinating water. And so we can make water available to any oceanfront region in the world. And that's where most people live. And actually, the cost associated with using wave energy is actually less than a huge desalination plant would cost. Again, and you have to remember, this is not just about material science and membranes, and it's also about energy and taking advantage of free energy, such as we get from the sun, the wind, and then when combined with technologies like synthetic biology, there's really no reason that we will ever need to use oil again for anything. I'm convinced of that. That by itself will solve the whole climate problem. But that's a little way Pollyannish. But the point is that we have the tools. What we often lack is, and sometimes the will has to be goaded by the regulatory side of things and the financial side. So we see today a huge movement toward ESG investing, environmental social governance, but it's mostly about environmental. Call it ESG, but it's mostly E&S. And the fact is that financial institutions are putting their weight behind trillions of dollars of investment, including organizations like BlackRock, which manages $5 trillion. So this is happening. This is a great opportunity for affecting climate, but again, it's not all on technology. We need a movement, such as the ESG movement, such as the regulatory movement, and then we can start moving the needle.
John, any other thoughts in terms of access to clean water, the problem of economic or physical water scarcity, and what we should be doing to address this?
There's a lot more monitoring that we should and could do. One thing we found in various potential hotspots, some of which have already exploded, is there are places in northern India and possibly places like Central Valley, California, where very poor people who live on the land and produce a lot of our food are very susceptible to dry conditions. And the first thing you might think of doing is irrigating, but that gets to be expensive. I worked with Jeff Sachs a little bit on a sub-Saharan Africa project, and the models would show that with irrigation, you could actually increase farm incomes and farm output in the sub-Saharan region. But factoring in real constraints on the amount of funds available and expertise available, turns out only about 5 to 10% of that potential could be observed. In the aquifer case, the big problem has been without knowing exactly how much groundwater was there, non-sustainable, so sometimes called fossil water. Those were being depleted as a coping mechanism, while it was impossible to cope with warmer temperatures by irrigating. And unfortunately, with better measurement techniques, it now looks like some of these aquifers are close to collapsing completely. So there was this unfortunate incident about 4 or 5 years ago, again, in this very fertile but very dry region of India, where even before the crop returns came in, there were about 25 or 30 farmers who committed suicide because things looked so bad. I think we're likely to see this around the world. On the happy face side of this, I was glad to hear Tom's kind of solution space. Since about 2015, there's been a tremendous amount of interest and analysis in what happens if you look at both climate goals on the one hand and UN Sustainable Development Goals, interestingly made quantitative in a very forceful way, almost the same time as the Paris Accord was signed. And in that analysis, we see certain no-brainer synergies where if you reduce coal combustion without control, you're creating a lot of particles and really bad air pollution, previously discussed here, and exacerbating climate change on balance. So that's an easy positive one. In the water space, the work I've seen, it's a mixed bag. So you have to know what you're doing and strategically do this. Some of the solutions Tom mentioned, I think, are technological solutions that could be giving us new win-win solutions to that. So I think just because there's a conflict in goals and interest doesn't mean that you stop there. One thing I love about entrepreneurs in issues like this is that they keep the goals firmly in mind and don't get too hung up on my way or the highway. We see various groups of social scientists and ethicists having very narrow conceptions of what might solve these problems. Sometimes, in my view, losing sight of the ultimate goals and wanting their way to be the right way to solve the problem. So I applaud and encourage state-of-the-art entrepreneurs like Tom to jump in there and show us how things could be done in a better way.
So I want to talk about extreme events that have been tied to climate change, such as floods, droughts, hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, and how these extreme events have resulted in forced migration and affecting our basic access to the resource I mentioned, shelter. We saw what happened in Texas a few weeks ago with the rolling power outages and just the prolonged blackout that left many citizens in the dark and cold. How do we prepare communities for these extreme weather events, especially as it affects shelter?
You can prepare. You can harden all of the energy generating equipment that's out there. Most of the problem during the recent ERCOT situation was actually with liquid fuels. They didn't really have much of a problem with renewables. No problem with solar, some problem with wind, but nothing that couldn't have been prevented if the wind energy generating equipment would have been built in anticipation of more severe weather events than had previously existed. So my sense is renewables showed pretty well during this ERCOT period. It was actually the liquid fuels that had the most problems. Now, of course, there's a regulatory issue, and the fact that Texas had to have its own regulations independent of other states in the union, which didn't help. I think what many of us don't recognize is how ill prepared we were for this kind of an event. That, from what I understand, we were 5 minutes away from total grid shutdown in Texas. And to this day, nobody knows how they would have restarted it. There's complete hands up in the air on that one, which is pretty amazing. Now, hopefully, there'll be certain changes before we have the next snowfall in Texas, but it precipitated a huge crisis and a huge issue of social justice that we have to be very concerned about. We have to be. We don't hear a lot about the grid, but the grid is both a friend and foe at the same time. We see the deleterious effects and what happened in Texas, but we can democratize the grid. We can digitalize the grid. So long as we have renewables available, we can get rid of liquid fuels. We can talk about electrons. Once we have electrons to do our work, then the whole world changes. And it's, in fact, there's an institute that Arun Majumdar started at Stanford called Bits and Watts that's actually working on this problem. They're doing some really good work on both, but not just the grid, it's the information cloud as well. We need to make infrastructure improvements that will put us back on track in terms of our ability to grow GNP. GNP has declined since 2008 from pretty much linear path that it had been on before. We're not adding GNP at the same rate that we were. And part of that is that we don't have the infrastructure that enables us to apply technology to our benefit. A great example of that is that there are 47 million people in this country that do not have access to the broadband information cloud. During COVID, there were an almost equal number of people whose internet service was shut down for non-payment. So there's almost 100 million people in this country that did not have access to broadband internet. That is crazy. That would not be a hugely expensive infrastructure investment, considering how much we're now having to invest for the consequences of COVID and other misadventures. Clearly, these problems are solvable, and that's what gets me so frustrated, because people are not thinking the full dimension. It's not just about renewables, it's about upstream, downstream electrons and how we use electrons and how we take advantage of all this unbelievable technology that's been created in the last 50 years.
John, question for you is, Tom alluded to our infrastructure in the US just isn't sustainable long term. So building on Tom's comments, what do you think we need and should do to upgrade our infrastructure in the US?
I think, as we'll probably see in the current administration, just to be more aggressive at the policy level and either investing directly or creating incentive the private sector to do. So historically, we haven't been too bad in that. We did build the interstate highway system. We did build the natural gas pipeline network and a bunch of other things historically. We seem to have a political difficulty in making any investments that might pay off or over a long period of time, arguing more about immediate gratification, if I could put it that way. I do think the youngsters here, your generation, has the ability to influence such things because the impacts of climate change are now more obvious to everyone. We have better data ability to monitor. We've been arisen, hate to use a trite word, to the social and environmental justice issues that will likely dominate actual decision making. So since I got out of hardcore engineering about 1980, I've spent most of my time on social sciences, first following economics and systems analysis and a few other things, and then later into political science and social sciences in a way I never thought I would. As many of the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center, we did, Jim Sweeney, my boss at that point, brought together computer scientists with behavioralists and tried to design these. I think Tom was referring to what we now call behavioral nudges. So 20 years ago, economists said behavior is second order. We're not going to waste our time or our faculty thoughts on such people. Now every major top 20 econ department in the country is looking for their second or third or more behavioral economists, being totally shameless about saying something they thought previously wasn't important and probably didn't exist, to saying it's now part of our discipline, but that's okay. Again, we don't want to fight about who's got the best ideas. We want to take all the available ideas. So I am somewhat optimistic we can manage these basically institutional and social constraints a lot better than we have. A lot of it has to do with what people have called in the justice community and so forth, transparency. Democracy does not work as well as we might hope if there is not transparency. So I think we got into this greatest generation paradigm, which was good. I fortunately got to talk to George Shultz before we lost him about this. His generation said, what we need around the world is democracy. That leads to greater transparency, which leads to market economies, which leads to perfect markets, which leads to ideal, perfectly efficient solutions. And a lot of that train was true for a while. Now I think we're realizing that not all agents in markets, Tom already mentioned one big company, I could mention several others, actually are doing things in a way that's perfectly competitive, nor do they internalize what we now call social good. We now see not just the financial community getting into the climate game in a way they didn't up until 10 years ago, but more recently, major IT firms. I've been amazed that Jeff Bezos is trying to play catch up and has a major sustainability initiative. First set of pilot projects here at Stanford, now probably going to be a major new initiative alongside Google and Apple and all the rest.
Thanks, John. So we talked about so far 4 main resources that are essential for human survival: food, water, air, and shelter. And of course, Tom added and reminded me of another one, energy. I have a few questions on that. At a very high level, of course, we need clean, efficient, and affordable energy systems. And that's been a big need that startups and investors have worked to tackle. Tom, how has investing in energy systems today differed from when you were active in the first wave of clean tech investing in Silicon Valley around 2008?
Yeah, it's changed dramatically. Clearly, the energy industry, I believe, reached its peak in the 1970s. 1970s, resources were king, partially due to the oil crisis that took place in the 70s. It started to turn people head to our dependency on oil and gas and how harmful that is, not only from a climate perspective, but from a resources perspective. Spending trillions of dollars to defend the oil resources in the Persian Gulf during the Gulf War, I don't think that was a very use of our capital. And yet we've been so consumed by oil and gas. And believe I worked for Exxon. I know something about the oil and gas business, and certainly the industrialization associated with coal and oil and gas proceeded from 1750 to today, encouraged a lot of progress for humankind, but we're paying one hell of a price for it. The good news is we don't need oil and gas anymore. We can make everything we've previously made from oil and gas. We can, including energy, we can make it from renewables. We can make it from synthetic biology. These things will happen. And I believe that decreasing our dependence on oil and gas is certainly can only have positive consequences for humankind in almost every way. And what's going on now is a transition. Fortunately, we have a government that has some consciousness about the opportunity to switch over to renewables and the consequences of that. That will help. But the other thing that's happened is that these major resources of energy, food, water, available to us now cost that is far less than ever, and it's declining every day. Solar is essentially free at this point, and that's what enables Source Global to make their purified water. And Solar Plus is actually a major theme of our investment practice. How do you apply solar to do all kinds of things, not just electrons? What is then the impact on non-carbon fuels? We haven't talked about hydrogen, but there's a tremendous opportunity for us with low-cost hydrogen. There are issues, of course, there's always issues, but they're not impossible. On the one hand, optimistic, on the other, very impatient. But we're over the hurdle. All these issues that that we think about are all about manufacturing cost curves and price elasticity of demand. And we've overcome the mathematics of scale in renewables, and we can put it to work now to totally take care of carbon problem. But it's not just, the issue is not to, it's not only to stop contaminating the atmosphere with carbon, but get rid of the carbon that we've already dumped in the atmosphere. And I think the area that I see as most promising is in regenerative agriculture, means of mineralizing CO2 in the form of carbonates and other minerals, things like olivine. In other words, creating value from the carbon dioxide, not just paying somebody $100 a ton, or actually, which is, I think, fiction, probably more like $1,000 a ton for direct air capture or air capture in general. I do believe that we have a great opportunity now that we've done this scaling, we have free solar, and we can put it to work.
Optimistic and impatient, indeed. John, question for you regarding policy and the Biden administration. Biden has stated a pretty bold climate vision, maybe not bold enough, to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and also to achieve zero carbon electricity by 2035. What predictions do you have on what his administration will actually do, and how will this affect investments in the sector?
I would say, from what I can tell, there's a great mobilization going on. A lot of the great people and advisors like Tom have been brought back in immediately, even before the inauguration, even before the election, as the odds seem to be going one particular way. I think there'll be a very big renaissance, as we learned from the book we did together. A lot of these people went through the early 2000s Clean Tech 1.0 and then came back for the Obama administration and made much more substantial impact through things like the establishment of ARPA-E and a number of other things. And I think this time, the time is even riper now than before. So I think we will see a lot of action now institutionally. Probably most of you didn't know what an executive order was before Obama, and a lot of you before Trump. If that's the way it needs to get started, it'll get started. The Congress will come around, I predict, if those things start being successful, because they'll then want to take credit for saving the world and doing so in a low-cost business, green business friendly way. Moderately to very optimistic. I'm a Hegelian philosopher, so I think the way we learn how to do things, particularly when we have to move fast, is creating a meritocracy where everybody's ideas are heard and absorbed, and then somebody with some political will and know-how makes the final decision. So I'm optimistic. That's what we're going to see. My cause for more optimism now than, say, even when Obama came in is thanks to people like Tom. The technology base is better. Thanks to a lot of research people have done, we know more about what they're doing. And finally, because of young people like you, those of you in this class, I think that may be ultimately the biggest and most important resource that we can tap into as we move ahead with you and your national and international networks of various sorts. Thanks.
Yeah, we actually just one comment on that. We actually spent a few months trying to quantify the magnitude of the opportunity that we have as a result of the pioneering work that was done in the first clean tech program. It's the old story. Pioneers always end up with arrows in their backs. But the fact is that we've ended up as a society with scaled technologies that can deal with a lot of our problems. We just have to go about it in a very orderly way, recognizing all the dimensions, all of the vectors among regulatory, technology, and financial that are required to bring this movement home. And our attempt to quantify the opportunity resulted in, we estimate that the energy transformation that will take place globally over the next 10 to 20 years will engender opportunities in the range from $1 to $10 trillion. One of the reasons why ESG investing has become so interesting, because there's an opportunity to make money via this transformation, not only by building GNP, but also very simply replacing obsolete infrastructure.
Thank you both for paving the way early on. I want to turn to some questions from the class. One of the questions is, how do we incentivize all countries to collaborate together on sustainability, especially given game theory? Maybe the student who asked it could add some additional commentary.
Hi, everyone. I was the one who asked the question. So I think the question here is just about how do you get countries to work together? Because I feel like it's a global problem. Like each country produces its own greenhouse gases, it uses different type of energy. But at the same time, like developing countries are saying that, hey, the rich countries got rich by destroying the environment. We need to grow first before we can protect the environment. And then there were also cases where, someone like Trump could unilaterally decide to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. So the question is about how do we bring everyone in the world together to align on some of these very global problems?
Yeah, capitalism is certainly a great motivation, and the opportunity of the magnitude that I described, $1 to $10 trillion a year, certainly ought to attract a lot of people to come together and work on this. But it's also an issue of survival. I think about my grandchildren. I think about what kind of world they're going to face if we let carbon run up into 450 plus parts per million. It's not going to be fun. At the same time, the phrase I love is doing well by doing good. I believe it's as simple as that. It's in everyone's interest to do well by doing good, to make sure that they work in collaborative means, some of which is going to have to be stimulated by regulatory. Some of these functions are going to have to be forced to come together, and legislation is probably the best way to do that, at least in a democratic society like we have here. But you're absolutely correct. We have to appeal to people's sense of greed or sense of justice to be willing to come together in a movement that will affect the kind of change that we need to see. These have to be it's almost like, the way I think about it, like a software stack. So you have these vectors of regulatory, financial, technology, and then you have networks among these vectors. It's those networks that have to smooth that stacking function that really are required.
One other question from the class, maybe for inspiration, what are some countries that have done a good job in addressing some of the resource problems we discussed around air, food, water, shelter, energy, and specifically, what can we learn from them? Who asked that question?
That was me as well. Yeah, I think it was just like, I think different countries have different ways of solving it. What are some maybe like centers of excellence around the different types of sustainability, whether it's around food, water, and so on, that we can learn from? I'm from Singapore originally, so I know that we have a lot of issues with trying to secure like food and water security. And I think we've done a couple of things. For example, like desalinating seawater, but also processing urine so that we can get good drinking water. But I think I was just, and also I think some of our classmates are from Israel spent a good amount of time there as well. And I think they've done some of these questions well. But was hoping to also hear from the professors and the experts here on what else are stories that we can learn from other countries.
Well, I think those are two pretty good examples. You mentioned Singapore and Israel. Maybe even better is a little country called Bhutan, where they actually have a constitution that says they should pursue happiness and sustainability explicitly. So maybe not all the countries could scale up to their level, but the idea of reconsidering, I think Tom really touched on this. What the heck are we doing and what are our goals individually and collectively, particularly collectively? Again, back to your other problem, there are a group of people who have studied the problems that you identified, the free rider problem. And actually for me, observing the UN process, as in many UN processes, it's a great place for countries to come vet and express their frustration and what their interests are. I think a lot of this necessarily needs to get worked out from the bottom up because different countries are so heterogeneous. It's hard to get a kind of a monolithic solution. I personally think Paris, although it's not legally binding, which was the original goal for the Framework Convention, was a big step forward because it got all countries engaged in doing what they could from their own perspective. I think within the major emitting countries, obviously Germany has done better than most. I work a lot with Japan. Japan was already pretty efficient and now straining to get, even in the aftermath of Fukushima, trying to get more efficient. So I think there are examples out there. Again, I like in that the entrepreneurial version of this, where I personally think development planning would have been a lot better off globally if we took it out of the hands of the economists who had wonderful theories that looked good on paper and didn't work in practice. So I think having entrepreneurs go to each and every country and saying, okay, I understand the damn theory, but here we are looking the people in the face and seeing what they are interested in wanting to do. Let's improvise and help them achieve their goals through technology or new business models, or what I call what many people now call institutional entrepreneurship. So I just think we have to be more bold and think globally again and act locally and build up. Again, what I see in the political frame is if you do something that's a little bit far out and it turns out to be successful, the policymakers will be happy to help you do that. So the policymakers may not want to do $1,000 or $100 or $200 carbon tax, but if you get them close enough to say, given all our bottom-up activities, we can make the market a bit more efficient with a much smaller carbon tax or other types of incentives, I think they'll probably do it and take credit for it. But that's a good thing because then everybody will be on the same page finally.
Thanks, John. Tom, any final thoughts for today's class?
Oh, one comment I could make is I really what Elon Musk has done with his $100 million X Prize for carbon removal. He is absolutely picked up on the concept of not only do we need to deal with carbon emissions, but we need to deal with carbon restoration. That is, we need to perhaps get back to pre-industrial levels of carbon as 350 parts per million, perhaps. But it's the point is that he wants to make an impact on carbon neutrality, but also carbon negativity. That's what we have to keep in mind. I think many of the ideas that are out there right now are just not aggressive enough.